Hello, and welcome to the sixth installment of our Project Elevate series. The purpose of these is simple. We aim to elevate the knowledge you have on IriusRisk for specific topics and areas to help you get the most from our tool. And if you're not a customer yet, don't worry. We hope you'll still find this useful as a deeper dive into each feature or capability. This particular session is being delivered by James Rabe, our Head of Professional Services. I'll hand you over to him in just a moment. And then in terms of the agenda for today, we'll set the scene for our threats and countermeasures as we've had some important product changes recently. You can expect to see some use cases for managing your threats. We'll cover prioritization of these, and we'll also show you how you can conclude by taking actions on your countermeasures, especially those with the highest risk, and demonstrate how to filter these to focus on what matters most. Okay, without further ado, it is demo time. So James, over to you.
All right, as we kind of previously discussed and what Claire has really already introduced here, right? Some of the benefits of automated tooling is that with automated tooling, we have the ability to automatically generate threats and countermeasures. Now, with that also comes sometimes we're generating a little too much and we struggle with how do we prioritize things that are the most important inside of our threat model. And that's really where the focus of this demo is going to shift, because we're going to go through our model and systematically figure out what's most important and how do we prioritize those things. And then how do we build in automation to further reduce the mental overhead of even having to do that prioritization process. So let's go ahead and just take a look at the threat model we're going to be using for today. So the first thing you'll notice on here is we've got the first thing we're doing to limit the noise coming from our model is I'm clearly defining, I've got a web client here. That web client is clearly out of scope. And I'll show you what the impact of that's going to be once we move over into our threats and countermeasure interface. Because if I can remove a component from that view, maybe that component has 5 threats attached to it, and each of those threats might have a couple countermeasures attached to them. So by removing the component, I can go ahead and just say, hey, all of those threats, all of those countermeasures, those are immediately not in scope. Okay, so that's automatically going to start reducing that noise, reducing that overall risk position for that given component. And the next thing you'll notice here is you can see I've got a WAF, which is inside of AWS environment. I've got a virtual private cloud. I've got an EC2 instance, which is then hosting my ability to log in. I've got an e-commerce coupon being exchanged, and then I've got a shopping cart function inside of that EC2 instance. And that's working with a Postgres database in the backend, which also has an API endpoint attached to it, allowing people to make changes. And you see I'm mixing a little bit of my assets here. I've also got some protected health information on here just to demonstrate we've got some assets being exchanged. So without further ado, let's go ahead and go look at this model. Now, I do want to call your attention to something here on our home screen for this model. You'll notice I automatically have 24 countermeasures implemented. This would be probably my #1 recommendation for how to reduce the noise inside of the IriusRisk tenant is if you've got a set of environmental controls. So for example, this threat model takes place in an AWS environment. I probably have a set of overarching technical controls inside of AWS that I know have already been implemented, and they're always implemented. So if you break down your model really into thirds, we have the technical controls that are based on the environment. Maybe they're based on infrastructure. And I've got some sets of controls that are always on. So for example, not allowing ingress from, port 21 over 0.0.0.0, right? That's never allowed. That rule is always enforced from the WAF. All of my administrators have unique accounts. I always have logging and monitoring enabled and turned on, that I'm backing those up to a centralized source. S3 buckets are never going to be public facing. If I am enforcing some of those controls at that environmental layer, I can go ahead and write sets of rules that will auto implement those. So that's what you're seeing here with that 24 countermeasures that have been implemented. I created this diagram, and as I placed items on that diagram, it's gone through and said, based on what you've told me, these items have been automatically implemented. Okay, and what that does is it lets me go immediately to Now I can bypass all of those countermeasures. All of those threats have already been mitigated, so I don't have to worry about those as much. Okay. Now, the next thing we're going to do is start looking at the other threats attached to my tenant and how do I go through and prioritize those. So to do that, let's go over to the threats and countermeasure interface. And as you'll see on my left-hand side, I have 77 threats found, and I've got 181 countermeasures attached to those 77 threats. Now, when I go through and look at the left side, you'll see I have some nesting done here. So the first thing I want to do is, remember, we marked that browser as out of scope. I want to go ahead and go grab that browser. I'm going to go ahead and just mark all of those threats as NA because they're not going to be in scope for this model. So I'll come over and I'll select the dropdown, select the dropdown again, and I'm going to go ahead and just grab that entire web client, and I'm going to go ahead and go up to mark those as NA here. So let's go ahead and just open up my general use case. You see I've got those selected. My general use case, and you'll see I'll have this bulk edit that will come up here. I'm going to go ahead and go down to not applicable, and I'll just say browser is not in scope for this model. And I go ahead and mark those as not applicable. And what we'll see, this process is running. It'll take just a second. And then what I'll see is that these items are actually going to move into an NA status. So we can go ahead, if we want to come back up here, we can choose to hide our NA threats so that we're not seeing those. And you can see now that component is gone from my view because I've go ahead and moved that into an NA position. Okay. Now, the next thing that I prefer to do here, either A, I'm going to prioritize based on a certain component, or I'm going to prioritize based on my overall risk position. So either A, I could go into my AWS account environment, and you'll see that inside my VPC, I've got my database. So this is going to be obviously where all of my data is being stored at. So maybe this is something I want to prioritize because that's where the data is being held, and that's obviously what I want to protect. So I could go through and prioritize by component, or if I wanted to, I could choose to use my flattened threat view, which takes away the component, but then lets me see, what's going to be my critical risk, my high risk, my medium risk inside of here. And then I can further filter those down to just see items that are inside of my critical risk. So see, now I've filtered this. Now I'm only seeing that subset. I think we had 11 that were currently in that critical risk, right? And then I can open these up and I can start to work through the different countermeasures inside of my critical risk, right? And this is going to be that more risk prioritized approach. I could have also gone through and I could have segmented based on my other filter, and I could obviously filter by use case. So if I wanted to filter based on elevation of privilege related threats, or if I wanted to filter based on information disclosure, depending on really what my role is. I could also filter based on current risk we talked about, my risk mitigation, any countermeasure progress, my test status. If I had any tags attached to my components, I could also choose to filter by that. So if I wanted to prioritize, even in my diagram, that this particular component was going to be, version 1 of my threat model priority, I could then have version 1.1 priority. I can tag individual components within that model to help me and help my team prioritize the threats and countermeasures accordingly. Now, obviously, we're generating a lot of countermeasures, and you see I've got 24 that are implemented, 11 are required, and I've got 138 that are recommended. Now, I don't immediately have a problem with this ratio because remember, required inside of IriusRisk, these are going to reflect the countermeasures that are actively needing to be implemented. Recommended is just like the word recommended sounds. These are countermeasures that are available to be implemented, but aren't necessarily required yet. Okay. And the reason why, they're not recommended could vary based on either A, your capacity to implement those items, could also be based on, we don't know if they need to be implemented in our environment. So it could be based on your technical controls. So a good way we can start to review the items that are recommended and determine how many of those need to be required. Obviously, we can go through and we can do this manually. I can go through and I can review all the different items in here. And you can see I've got several of which are critical. I also have the ability to apply standards. Now, standards allow us to invoke a tag that's sitting on top of the countermeasure, and that tag will move a countermeasure from a recommended state into a required state. So you saw in my diagram how I had protected health information. Because I have protected health information, I'm saying that this is in scope for HIPAA. So I'm managing patient data or some type of healthcare related data that it's identifiable about patients. So in that instance, I could have said, I want to go through and use the HIPAA addressable and the HIPAA required standards. And I can go through and select require. And that's going to go through and look at all of my countermeasures in that recommended state. And it's going to find any of those countermeasures that are in scope for HIPAA addressable. So I'll go ahead and say require, and you see it's going to go ahead and move some of those over into a required state. I can also go down and do HIPAA required. And then you're going to say right here, so it's already noticing it saying that, hey, all of those countermeasures have already been moved into required, so you don't have to do that again, right? So it's just letting you know that it's already been done. And then if I wanted to, I could actually go through and filter based on those different statuses. So you see here, I can see according to HIPAA, which ones are going to be in a required status, which ones are non-compliant. You can see down here, these currently are required. And then I can actually go through and say, okay, well, we also want to add those to this. So I can move them into a required state. So allowing me to prioritize and filter here based on obviously my status, obviously my priority, but also based on my compliance status as well. So we've got several different methods and mechanisms by which to prioritize different sets of countermeasures, different sets of threats. My recommendation is usually to start with, what's going to be in scope, what's most important for that model. And then I start to highlight my component. I determine, is that component in scope? From there, I triage what are my most critical threats. And the way that I determine what's going to be most critical is by providing that information on my model. So, what kind of trust zone is it in? What type of assets have been assigned to it? And then based on those different types of assets, I can then go through and answer different types of questionnaires, right? So if we go back over to our diagram, for example, if I'm going through here and I'm providing necessary context to my different models, so if I go over and click on shopping cart and right click and go to complete questionnaire, you'll notice that I have questionnaires on here for security context. And each of these different questionnaires will actively go through and from my diagram, will go through and mitigate different countermeasures on my diagram, or excuse me, on my threat model. So if I go up and say, do you enforce rate limiting? We'll say, yes, it's been implemented. I'll go to my next one. Do you have a comprehensive logging and auditing? We'll say yes. Do I have anti-CSRF tokens in place? Yes. Proper access control implemented? Yes. Do I have session management? I can say not sure. I can say no, this is not addressable. We'll go ahead and say no, but it's required, which will then move that countermeasure from a recommended to a required state. Do you practice secure deserialization? We'll say yes. Do you verify prices? Yes. And again, it's all going through all of these secure design items. And what that's doing is as I say yes to these different questionnaires, it's automatically going to implement those items inside of my threat model when I go into my threats and countermeasure interface. So not only do I have the ability to apply context from my diagram and start to auto implement some of those countermeasures, but I can go directly into threats and countermeasures and I can review, I can filter, I can prioritize based on any given number of factors inside of there. So now if we click back over to home, we'll actually see now that implemented number has moved up, I think, from 24 up to 30. And that's all just based on a single component by me providing context about how it's been implemented and what's been most important about that particular component in the context of the broader threat model. So again, noise is always going to be something that we work on filtering, but by providing the necessary context in that model, you're going to turn that noise into something which is actionable, high priority, high value countermeasures inside of your diagram. So Once we've gotten to that point, now we want to then maybe only see the countermeasures that are only going to be required and are also going to be high value. So this is really kind of getting into that final step. I have the ability to use these preset fields where, for example, I can see high priority required countermeasures. So now this narrows this down to the countermeasures that are high priority and the ones that are required. So the ones where our team has gone through and said, these are the ones we're going to prioritize. And you can see I prioritize my Postgres database. I've got a couple on my shopping cart, and I've got a couple related to my API endpoint. So we've gone from building the model to the triage process to only seeing the output that is most required. And then I can even go through, if I wanted to, I could see maybe I want to add additional filter items here. I want to see them based on a certain component or based on a certain testing state. And then I can even save that particular view up here as a custom view as well. So it gives you the ability to further customize that final output based on your priorities. So, and hopefully that kind of demonstrates, right, beginning to end, how I go from building my model all the way to tailoring that final output to something that is more actionable for my particular role, whether I'm in application security or operational security. You get what you need to see based on that grouping.
Wow, I did have a list of questions to ask you, but I'm just reading them, and I think you've covered most of it in your explanations. It sounds like one of the core things is to ensure the context, the detail, all of the assets are identified right at the beginning when you create that threat model, when you're doing your diagram. And I love that you showed an item that was out of scope, because then it's still visible on your entire architecture. You know that it's there. Maybe it's partner remit, not your own, but then you still get to see it when you're at the diagram level, so you appreciate it's part of the broader picture. But then, as you showed, you didn't have to take any security control. There were no actions required. So I think that worked pretty well.
Yeah, and the nice thing about doing that is it shows that broader context and how data is being transmitted between, the area that I'm responsible for and someone else's area, because obviously where those where my domain and someone else's domain begins, sometimes we have a lapse in security controls because we're not really sure who's responsible for what in between those two systems, right? And then also by providing the assets, it allows the countermeasures that are attached to more sensitive components to float to the top, while areas where I don't have sensitive assets being stored, those can float to the bottom, because by providing that necessary security context, it lets me get to what's truly most important in my model at the same time.
Awesome. Thank you very much, James. I think we can wrap up now. And probably to conclude, just to say, even if you've got 200 countermeasures or whatever the exact number was that you showed a moment ago, that doesn't mean you've got 200 actions. We know full well that you can't, mitigate every single risk. So that's why you do it by priority. So I think, yeah, thanks. I think what you've shown us has been really helpful.
Well, and to that end, right, remember, I've got 12 right now that are actionable. That's based on this iteration, right? Agile threat modeling. I'm going to go through this multiple times. I'm pulling out what's most important. And then I'm going to come back and do this again in some predefined sprint or predefined duration of time. So, but I appreciate it, Claire. Thanks for hanging out and talking through a couple of these prioritization items.
Thank you for being here, and no doubt see you on another one very soon. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Claire.